Let's just start with the what has seemingly been the talk of town for weeks now since his unfortunate accident at the NHRA Virginia Nationals at VMP, Virginia Motorsports Park, just outside Richmond. John Force on the road to recovery. I want to tell you guys that I had an offline conversation with a dear friend of mine that's a doctor. He's a psychiatrist. He's been in practice for 40 years. He shared some information with me that the timeline for recovering from these types of things. And I got to ask you guys, I mean, I think, what I do wonder if that there's an opportunity here to really kind of start thinking about what the next phase of all of this looks like, right? I've had multiple conversations is like, how long do you think it is before John's back in a car? And I understand that none of us want to, speculate too terribly here, but I do, pose this question. Mike, I'll start with you. I mean, what do you think like the dialogue is at NHRA right now internally as they kind of, I mean, at the bare minimum, we knew that John Force was racing on borrowed time, right? The man's 75 years old. We have, kind of anticipated a retirement tour. We had heard earlier this year, John making some of his first public remarks about potentially retiring. I think we can all think back on that really iconic top-end moment between John Force and Austin Prock, where he handed Austin the trophy, that little gold man, and it kind of felt like a passing of the torch. To me, I get chills just thinking about the significance of that moment, especially as we look back on what's happened the last few weeks. But I'm just curious, like, do you think the entire sport of drag racing and those that are, invested, especially at our sports pro levels, probably have needed to be thinking about, the sport post John Force as an active driver for years now?
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, like, do you think that, I mean, what does that look like to you? Do you think those conversations are happening, or do you think
it's probably, snuck up on them all of a sudden? I mean, we've been talking about it for years that we as a whole, not just in HRA, but just all of us kind of need to start doing the work to find the next John Force. And I think we have started to maybe turn that corner. Maybe it's Austin Prock. Maybe John has seen that in Austin Prock and why he felt comfortable making that statement at the top end. And I do think that it is ironic that just weeks after we see hear the first time John Force even mention retirement, or that the end being near at some point, that this happens. And it's, you just never know. You never know what the next day is going to bring. I think that John Force Racing, John himself, NHRA, everyone would love to plan out this grand retirement tour or wind this thing down on his own terms, but he may not get that opportunity. And if that is the case, then it's, to me, these guys, I talked about like my own experience with my dad, and I think of racers like Ricky Smith, or just guys that have been doing this forever. And it's more times than not, sadly, it takes something like this to get those guys out of the car, because they will go down in a ball of flames in that car, and nothing can get them out. Nothing, because as soon as John started mentioning retirement, he started backtracking. I don't know what got into me. I don't know why I said that. And he immediately started going back. How many times have we seen Ricky Smith retire and it just show up to the next race, right? I mean, it's so hard for these guys. We think about the Tom Brady's, Brett Favre's, a lot of these guys that are great at what they do and really have built their whole lives around it. No other way. Don't know anything else to do. And unfortunately, things like this happen that sort of force your hand. So I think it is going to be, accelerating the timetable of however this was going to look for John Force. We're all hopeful that everything can get 100% back to normal, but if it can't, this is going to kind of serve as a reminder that we always have to be on the look for the next superstar, and that what these guys do out there is dangerous. We've taken so much of the drama and I don't want to say excitement, but this kind of stuff happened all the time in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and further back. But as safety has gotten so good, it's almost jarring when something like this happens. And they're already hard at work to make sure it doesn't happen again, thankfully. But it takes something like this, of this magnitude, for big safety changes to be implemented. So to me, it's a double-edged sword. I think we have to focus on the positive and focus on where we go from here and how to make it the most positive and carry forward. But again, I don't want to speculate. We have no inside knowledge. We have no knowledge of what's going on with John. and that it's a personal family matter. And I think that that is what matters the most. But this is such a tight knit community that we all feel like family with John at this point. So
I think that that's a fantastic
Yeah.
segue for really where I wanted this conversation to head next, Mike, was really I've labored over this, and there's kind of two distinct pathways that I want to take here. But I guess first, let's address for those that don't know. Yesterday on Joe Costello's WFO radio program, NHRA announcer Alan Reinhart was on the show, and a part of the conversation was the recounting of a conversation that Alan Reinhart had with NHRA technical director Lonnie Grimm, kind of going over what happened and in addressing some of the curiosity, some of the questions surrounding why the parachutes on John Force's Nitro Funny Car failed to deploy upon the explosion of the engine, which is how the electromotion, the Leahy device is designed to function, that it can sense failure, I believe Alan Reinhart said, in one of three ways: and an engine explosion, a massive spike in pan vac pressure, etc. But for whatever reason, which it sounds like they have gotten to the bottom of, and I would like to preface this by saying that I've used the word preface 3 times today now. I would like to start by saying that this is not an official statement from the NHRA. We have reached out. Our director of digital content, Kayla Zadell, has been in fairly constant communication with the NHRA, looking to get to the bottom of this. She is something of our in-house investigative journalist and has really taken this taking the bull by the horns here to try to get to the bottom of this, because I do think while we have got now some relative explanation as to what exactly happened, and I'll catch you guys up briefly, that the system is a fairly simply functioning system. The air cylinder is mounted in the car, and there's a wire that runs from it to the parachute handle to pull it. When the air cylinder is triggered, it pulls it back, opens the chute, pulls it, and then drops the parachutes. For whatever reason, whenever the concussion, the explosion of the engine somehow compromised the area between that air cylinder and the parachute release. So it's something that they're going to work to improve. It's a problem that they have never encountered before. But I really want to talk about kind of just what our expectations are, because it really, I have no issue, Mike, with the explanation. I am anxiously awaiting an official report or an official statement from NHRA, because I think it's due. I'm not saying it's overdue, but I do think an official statement beyond the announcement of the crash and his transportation to a medical facility, I do think that our sport is far enough along that in the times that we live in of seemingly hyper transparency, a tremendous amount of information being thrown at us at any given time, I do think that it is time to hear something, and I'm anxious to see how that unfolds.
I think they're working on it. I really do, giving them the benefit of the doubt. And I think we've had some informal communication with some contacts there that they are still like in the process of figuring it out and gathering like an official statement. And I don't know that I think what Alan was talking about, I think maybe was a little more informal, or maybe a little more, I guess, behind the scenes, or maybe not unauthorized, but unofficial. Maybe just some of his internal conversations he's had through some of his connections. But I think, before we get on to that about the statement, just from a technical standpoint, I think a lot of people here are technically minded and would like this discussion. So are we basically saying that the cylinder is mounted somewhere in close proximity to the chute release, and somewhere in inside the car, and that somewhere between that distance the car was compromised and kind of severed that connection?
That's my understanding. That there's actually a comment here from Dave Miller, and he says because it's mounted on the roof of the body, instead of mounted on the chassis like a Top Fuel car, which to me, like, just from a 30,000 foot view and piecing it together, that checks out, and I guess for me,
well, there's also, sorry to interrupt, but and from what I understand, and again, I don't know a ton about this system and about how it functions, it almost seems like this rule is open for interpretation and different implementation by different teams. And that it's not like a hard and fast, this has to be here, this has to be here, this has to be a certain distance. I think that if it's all within, I don't know, spec, tolerance, whatever, and it's approved by NHRA, I'm sure they inspect it and say, yeah, that'll work, that meets the standards. But I think each team has a different approach to it. And I think that each driver has a different approach to the location of the chute handles, the system that they use, where it's mounted. I think some probably use a wheel mount or lower mounted, some are on the roof, whatever. I mean, and maybe maybe someone in the comments can educate us more, or more about it yourself, Wes. But it seems like between all these different variables, that's kind of where this issue was created. That maybe there needs to be less interpretation, less option as far as where you place these things, so that it prevents this failure. And if that's what we learn from this, and that's the good that comes of it, then I think that that's great. But I think up until now that these safety things kind of haven't been implemented by different teams in different cars for different reasons, in not a non-standard way, but each car has a little bit of variance to it. And maybe that was the situation here.
Well, I mean, and from our sources indicate that there are teams that are already making changes, which I think is very telling, which, actually tells me everything I need to know, that if teams are saying, okay, we've identified a potential pitfall or an issue that could exist with this system, and changes are being made. I'm told there are at least a few teams that are headed to the next stop on the NHRA tour with some changes made to their setup. So it's an interesting thing to me, but what it really brings to light, in my opinion, do you sense, like I sense, and I'm not trying to call anyone out here, but I guess it's the internet, and that's perhaps one of the things it's for. I do take some sort of issue, I guess, Mike, with the way some of these things are being communicated. It feels like there's a real tension about this, right? And some of it, like if you're a hyper passionate race fan or whatever, like you take these things seriously. And if you're involved in the sport professionally, of course you take these things seriously. But I sense a lot of, there's like a lot of back and forth. Like I go back to my opening statements about the outpouring of support we've seen in the heels of these tragedies. But what I've also seen is a real genuine interest and a real genuine curiosity amongst the racing community as to what happened. And I think that there's like there's
hyper focus on it.
Yes.
Because of the stakes of it. It's our biggest superstar with a, life-threatening accident. And I think that all of a sudden it creates intense scrutiny, and then it also makes NHRA slow down and try to really get a handle on this. So then,
my question to you, though, you're right. And so in the midst of this hyper curiosity that exists, this laser focus on this singular instance, to me, I'm an opportunist, right? And I go, can you not extrapolate like something positive from the fact that all these people care so deeply? I mean, you don't have to spend 5 minutes on social media right now to see multiple curious posts, questions, people wanting to know what happened. And I guess for me, what I'm sensing, like what I sensed in the delivery of that information from Alan Reinhart and from Joe Costello, and like I said, I'm not trying to like call them out. Like I love those guys, I'm happy for them. And I love the amount, we need more people reporting on the sport of drag racing. So this is a fantastic thing, but it does smack a little of like state-run media, where you have these two people that are, employed by the NHRA that are out here kind of like on the defensive or you know what I mean? It feels like the way this is being presented is kind of like snarky almost. And it's like, guys, I don't think it's bad that our fans want to know what happened. I actually think that it's a missed opportunity. I see this and I see all these people asking questions and wanting to know and saying what they think happened. The pins were left in, this happened, that happened. I understand that a certain amount of like wild, insane speculation is bad, but like there's clearly thousands of people that want to know what happened. Don't you see that as an opportunity to provide that information, to provide some transparency to fans, and
create a spotlight on tech and safety and those aspects of our sport, and what the safety safari does, and what Lonnie Grimm does, and their roles and their jobs. Like we kind of don't hear a lot about that and enough about that. And that's really what came of Earnhardt. I think that there's a stat, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there has not been a fatality in at least cup racing, maybe all of the forms of NASCAR racing, as far as Xfinity and truck, since Dale Earnhardt. That he was the last fatal accident in NASCAR racing. But and I attribute a large portion of that to the fact that we lost the biggest star in racing, and certainly in NASCAR racing at that time, due to doing an accident, a preventable accident that now we have so many safety measures in place to prevent that kind of thing. And I just hope that that's the case, that with John Force, that it shines a light on this. It shines and it creates more standardization, more checks on this stuff, so that we don't go through it again. And I also think that you have to kind of we're at a point now where John is, he's alive. We see him eating ice cream, taking a stroll on the sidewalk, or in a wheelchair with his family, with Brittany Force for her birthday. We're starting to see some more positive news. So now that we're kind of past that segment of this, now it's time to kind of start looking at what happened and see start to hear the facts and the information, because it is a little bit, it seemed maybe like insensitive to just focus on that while you're still so concerned about John. So now maybe we take a little bit more focus off that, let his family have some privacy, let him continue to recover, and let's focus on what happened here on track. Let's talk about it, and let's not be afraid to admit these are men and women strapping into 10,000 whatever 12,000 horsepower bombs. In the case of a funny car, they're literally sitting behind it with the whole drive line running underneath their body, with a fiberglass body sitting over top of it. And, this stuff's going to happen. And I guess that we need to be okay with that. Like this.
I agree. There's an inherent danger to our sport.
Yep.
There's an inherent danger into many sports, bull riding. I mean, it's dangerous.
And you can't remove that danger. I mean, I hate to say it, but man, that is part of any of these. Drag racing is an extreme sport to me, and that's part of extreme sport.
I would argue that it's the original extreme sport.
Every time you strapped your dad in his car, and every time I strapped my dad in mine, pulled that belt tight, I thought, hey, this you have to be okay, that could be the last time. And I told myself that every single run. That, I mean, I don't know if anybody else thinks that or goes through that, but I had to be okay with this. This is what we do, and this could be the last time. And if you're not okay with it, say something, stop, leave, quit, do something different. Or at least for myself, I had to kind of tell myself that.
I guess what I see is almost beyond the John Force thing. I don't like to see people in positions of power or authority being mad at fans for being fans. It seems like there's some disdain, like, oh, how dare you fans speculate? How dare you fans try to piece together what happened? What do you expect fans to do? That's like the definition of it. Like, if I go to a Dallas Mavericks game and come home after a loss, the whole way home, my son and I are picking it apart. Like, oh, they should have called a timeout there in the fourth quarter. They had a chance to win. I mean, that's part of being a fan. And what I feel is kind of happening is I feel like my wrist and the collective wrist of the drag racing fan base are being slapped for caring or being curious about what happened.
Drag racing has always had a weird relationship with being a fan versus being a participant. We've talked about this a lot. No one wants to identify as a fan. It's almost like bad or whatever. And then the fans are only allowed to be kept outside the walls.
We're identifying the reason why, because we treat them like shit. And it's like, it's one thing to ask them to sit in the hot sun, buy an expensive ticket, sit in the hot sun all day, endure oil downs and all the other catastrophes that drag racing is known to produce. We do all these things, right? And we ask a lot of our fans. We ask them to travel. We ask them to spend multiple days at the event to see it come to conclusion. I mean, we hear all the time comparing drag racing to these other sports that are over in 3 or 4 hours. An NFL game's over in 4 hours. A NASCAR race is over in 4 hours. Drag races take 3 days, right? I mean, we ask a lot of our fans, but we're then also going to ask them on the heels of our sport's biggest star getting injured in a really spectacular accident. We're then going to ask them, like, hey, we know we want you to sit out here and buy these tickets and buy this expensive food and all that, but we also want you to shut up and not ask any questions when things aren't going well. And I think that is a completely unrealistic expectation. And I think it speaks to the situation that, the NHRA and, drag racing perhaps as a whole has found itself in, where the fan base it isn't as strong as it needs to be. Like, if we want to grow and if we want to attract Fortune 500 companies and new sponsors, we got to grow the fan base. We got to have racers. Be there, no doubt. We must have racers. But we have to grow our fan base. We have to grow the audience. We need more eyeballs. And if we treat fans like, what if you're a relatively new fan to the sport of drag racing and then you got hooked earlier this year or what have you, or maybe your first time at the races was Thursday or Friday at VMP for the NHRA Virginia Nationals. John Force signed an autograph for you. You watch him win the Mission Foods Challenge and you're all excited. And now you're a John Force fan. And then he has this tragic incident. And on the heels of that, anytime you post on your social media that you're curious about what happened, or you're speculating about what happened, or you're wondering aloud what happened, you get berated by the elders of our sport for, how dare you? You don't own a funny car. You shouldn't care. You don't drive one of these things. You shouldn't care. I don't think that is not an attitude that is going to allow our
it's
sport
looking down. It's looking down on the fan, and it's almost like you have to be a participant. Those 3 and 4 day events is almost like it's built around, well, you're a participant anyway. You're going to be here anyway. So it's okay that we can go 3 or 4 days. It's never been built around that fan, that mainstream fan. And like I said, I mean, I honestly felt that personally early on. It was never cool to be a fan. You had to be involved in some way. I think that's why so many people, it's such a, I don't know what the word is, fraternal sport or whatever, where if you really love drag racing, you better find a way to be involved in it somehow, because that's the only way that you're going to be like accepted.
You're going to earn any street cred, or you're going to earn any, like any rep or whatever in the game. You've got to be a racer. And I'm telling you, man, like, there's a great comment here from Drag Race Mayhem. Like, half the fun is speculating. Half the fun is the conversation and what happened and what do you think happened and what do you think they said. That's half the fun. I spend my week seeking that shit out. I call people wanting to know what happened, or, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about that? I don't have a, I call people all the time, and I don't have a pro mod team, but I'm invested in what happens in pro mod. Right. And I think that we've really got to start changing the mindset and changing the attitude in the way we treat our fans. We have to enrich the fan experience. Like, I don't mean to beat this drum, but I think someone has to. We have to make this being a drag racing fan more attractive. And if the first time something bad happens and you are curious about it, you get your wrist slapped or you get scolded because how dare you be curious about what's going on? How dare you wonder? How dare you question these guys? I think that that's a really, really bad angle to take. I mean, we need to be, in my opinion, this served as something of an opportunity to be transparent with our fans.
For publicity.
They clearly care. They clearly care. Like, even John Force would recognize that there is an opportunity that is presented by all the attention that is going to be garnered by this crash, right? Even he recognizes. I mean, I was literally at lunch with my family the other day, and ESPN like showed a report or whatever, like a check-in on John Force's status. And I'm going, that type of thing typically is not happening. So, like, why wouldn't we feed that machine? So ESPN is reporting every time that John Force puts out an update. So if he's
the only person that would get that kind of update.
I'm putting out updates. Like, I'm putting out, discussions continue amidst the NHRA technical officials. It doesn't even have to.
John Force Racing social media, I think, actually did a very good job once John stabilized or whatever the situation was. They've done a good job keeping us up to date with those posts every couple of days. The long, image graphics or whatever with the explanation of exactly where he's at. I think that's been good. But yeah, one parallel that I can draw is, as far as leaning into bad news, is UFC 303. So this was supposed to be a huge watershed event for UFC because of the return of Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor breaks his freaking toe. There's speculation for weeks leading up to this. What's going to happen with UFC 303? Is McGregor going to fight? And instead of just like shutting it down, no talk about UFC 303, no talk about Conor McGregor, don't speculate, we're having the event, buy your tickets, buy your pay-per-view. They had to kind of toe the line and balance, but they leaned into that and then tried to, spin it positively as far as the replacement match for the headliner of that event, once it did confirm that McGregor was not there. But there's bad news every day in all these other sports. And I draw the parallel with UFC just because but
their employees of those other sports aren't engaging in the theories and online and everything else. I mean, they're.
Well, I mean, I think some.
Maybe not
a lot. Not a lot, really.
So what are you saying? Michael Chandler talked about Conor McGregor pulling out of his fight?
If you worked for the Chiefs, or if you worked within the NFL organization, and they caught you splattering a bunch of stuff all over the internet, or maybe even defending where you work, I mean, you'd probably be in some deep shit, actually.
Well, there's more of a hierarchy there. There's more of a separation. There's so many more millions and billions of fans of NFL or whatever. and then there's only a certain number of people that work at the UFC or at the Chiefs. But with drag racing, again, there's just such little separation between the fans, the participants, the drivers. It's like we're just kind of all lumped in together.
It is, and everybody kind of knows each other, to be honest.
And everyone knows each other. So even, I think Courtney Enders made a comment earlier, even someone like her who works in multiple facets of the sport, but is concerned about John on a personal level and as a fan of the sport and of drag racing, felt like they couldn't talk about it. And I think that's kind of how we all felt.
Well, I mean, and that's, I mean, to me, and I think that I actually, real quick, I would like to interject that I am absolutely shocked that I'm hearing Mike Carpenter reference UFC. It's a big moment for me, and I'm excited. But I was at UFC 303. I was at the fight Saturday night. And I think back to that, but throughout in the weeks leading up to UFC 303, constant speculation about what was going on with Conor McGregor.
Conor McGregor's their biggest star. He's their John Force.
They're talking about, there's video footage of Conor partying at some nightclub in Dublin or whatever. And people are wondering, is that recent? Is his haircut the same? It looks like his hair's shorter in this video. In this video, he has a beard.
He was partying.
And that when he
were speculating on like how much is he drinking or whatever.
Well, I mean, and to me, that's where the views come from. That's how you entertain your fans. Like, we're putting too much onus on the racing. Like, the racing has to happen. Like, it's almost like we somehow, NHRA has decided that like having the race is the goal. I would argue that the race is the expectation. That is what we owe the fans. That's the deal we've made, that we're going to put on a race. But that's not enough. Like, what keeps these other sports going are all the talking heads and pundits and speculators. I mean, I think about stick and ball sports, specifically NBA, and like the role that Skip Bayless and Stephen A. Smith play. It would almost seem that ESPN and Fox Sports, respectively, have those people in place just to say shit that will.
They're about to pay Stephen A. Smith $100 million. I just read. They're going to pay him a $100 million.
Mike's our Skip Bayless.
But I mean, listen, though. I mean, I feel like I'm the one who's always saying shit. Like, I'm the one that's going to get the glares next time I go to an NHRA race. But I'm telling you, I've seen 4 people with podcasts. Jason Galvin, whom I love and is a big part of our, has been a part of our events and I likely always will be. Jason Galvin, Jason Logan, Alan Reinhardt and Joe Costello. And I've seen them both produce podcasts in recent weeks that were really, in my opinion, I got off those going like, am I in trouble for caring about what happened? Like, am I in trouble? Like, should I not care what happened in John Force's crash? I feel like I should care. Right. And I do think that, and obviously in those immediate days, I get it. Sensitivity, we didn't know if John was going to be okay. We didn't know. There were a lot of unknowns, and it's obviously a private matter at that point. And I respect
these are the hard hitting questions, like this right here. This would be a lead on SportsCenter or on First Take.
It looked like an off pink, so I'm thinking strawberry.
It might have been. I was thinking like a sherbet swirl. Something.
It could have been. It could have been.
We'll debate.
But my point is just that I don't think it's fair to be mad or somehow scold our fan base for wondering what happened. I think it's their job to wonder what happened. I think it's their job to talk amongst themselves and fellow community members on social media about what happened. And I guess what my takeaway from this, because, they say rules are written in blood. And I think that's a very true statement. And I think that it is a foregone conclusion. I have enough belief in the drag racing community that we're absolutely going to better ourselves on the heels of this tragedy, right? We're going to improve the system. I feel like almost every time there's been an incident, right, we've found a way to improve because of it. And I think that's a foregone conclusion. But I do think that our fan base is well within their rights to want to know and be curious, and that should be embraced. I think there's an opportunity for the higher parts of our sport, or the people in positions of authority, to go, you know what? People really care. People really want to know what happens. And I think that we need to feed that. We need to feed our community and like I said, find a way to enrich that fan experience, because this is one of the few sports. Like, I've had hundreds of phone calls and text messages about the John Force situation over the course of the last few weeks. Not one of them was, hey man, we probably shouldn't be talking about this because it's none of our business. Every single one of them were much more like, hey, have you heard anything? Do you know anything? You got any inside information? And I think that I see myself as nothing more than a drag racing fan. And so when I see my other fans, my fellow drag racing fans, finding themselves being ridiculed or talked down to because they're curious, I think it's a bad look. And I think that there's an opportunity here for us as a sport to go, you know what? These people care. These are the most, and I understand, like, Jim Parks is making a great point in the comments right now. Shout out to Jim. He's one of our regulars. The most annoying speculation through all of this was that the shoot pins were left in. And I definitely think that it is tasteless to be, firing shots and calling people out and trying to identify some sort of shortcoming. However, I don't know that that is I'm not surprised by it in any way, shape, or form. I think that's what fans love to do. I know that's what I love to do. And like, again, we love John Force, and we're so glad to see him on the mend. And I'm hoping that if this is something, if this goes like most things with John Force, he will steamroll through this, and we will see him again at the track again soon.